Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to this event. We've had a lively and full Simpson week so far. If you've been with us for the week, it's been fantastic. We've appreciated Dr. Doug Gay being amongst us, and we look forward to today. I'm particularly excited about today because it brings together two things that I've spent time studying in my life and things that I'm very passionate about, which is politics and theology. And so really delighted, also delighted that we've been able to make this a little bit interdisciplinary and stretch beyond our own faculty that I hope will help us to think more clearly and stretch us and challenge us and maybe even together brainstorm different ways of thinking. Who knows? But we're open to the possibilities. Dr. Doug Gay serves as principal of Trinity College, Glasgow, and lecturer in practical theology there. He joined the Theology and Religious Studies in October 2005 after PhD studies in New College, Edinburgh, under Will Storr and David Ferguson. I think David's a great guy. Right? I don't know Will, sorry, but I'm sure he's wonderful too. He holds an MA in Modern History and International Politics from the University of St. Andrews and a BD from the University of Glasgow. He's an ordained minister who trained for ministry in the Church of Scotland and worked as a Church of Scotland minister for 2 years before spending 6 years working in Hackney, East London as a minister of United Reformed Church. He's worked as a religious columnist for the Times and also as a hymn writer and liturgist. And he's been stretching us this week, talking about the role of feelings in preaching and worship and the kinds of persuasion that go on there. But politics, I think, is the other, public theology is the other area of your specialization. So this gives us an opportunity to hear from Doug on that front, on God's Scotland and the politics of nationalism. And after he speaks and delivers his lecture, I'm delighted that Dr. Geoffrey Whitehall, head of politics here at Acadia, is going to join us on a panel, and together with Dr. Spencer Boersma from Theology. And I'll be facilitating this, I think, an interesting and I hope exciting exchange of ideas as we engage on these topics. So would you please begin by welcoming Dr. Doug Gay.
Well, there we are. So we're changing gear and changing mode a little bit from the other lectures. Some of you have been to the other lectures, and but I was really pleased to be asked to take part in this as part of this week. And so I'm going to give a bit of an introduction, and then I'm really looking forward to seeing how people respond and how you folks respond as well. So, yes, from scenes like this, Auld Scotia's grandeur springs. There's a little photograph of Scotland, territory, land, a photograph from space on a day when it maybe had as much snow as we have here. Here's another map that shows something rather different. These are the results by voting area of the Scottish independence referendum, which was held in 2014. I was just saying that there have been connections and dialogues for many decades between the independence movement in Scotland and the campaign for Quebec independence here in Canada. And that dialogue has gone on. And for a long time, one of the things that people were coming to Canada to learn was, how do you manage to get a referendum from the state that you want to break away from? How do you manage to get permission to do that and to be allowed to do that? And so, of course, this finally happened after a period of time in which the SNP, the Scottish National Party, had been doing increasingly better at the polls and had actually become rather dominant within Scottish politics. David Cameron famously granted them the Section 20 order that they needed to have a legal referendum, and it took place in September 2014. There was really a period of about 2 years in the run-up to that when everybody knew that it was go for the referendum, and it was an extraordinary period in Scotland's life. you ask different people, they'll give you different accounts of it. Some people were deeply miserable. Some people were deeply anxious. Some families fell out over it. And something the same way as you hear I hear of friends for whom Thanksgiving's a difficult time in the USA because there are divided opinions about their current president. So feelings were running high and were running strong in Scotland in the lead up to the referendum. From my side, I would say it's the most invigorating, exciting period of political debate and discussion I've ever been part of. And everywhere you went, really people were talking about it and were mobilized, and there was passionate conversations, and the cultural sector were very engaged. So writers and artists and poets and musicians formed. There was an organization called National Collective that brought people together. And so there was debate happening at every level in Scottish society around this. And if you lived in a city like Glasgow, where I live, it was easy to think if you were a supporter that you were going to win, because Glasgow went yes. Like some other cities, Dundee went yes. Some big cities went yes. But overall, as we will all know, no won, with 55.3%. And yes had 44.7%. Now, there was enormous grief and disappointment from some people and enormous relief from others. If you stood back, and I'll show you a graph in a moment, that looked at the long-term trajectory of increasing support for independence, to get from the base where people started to 45, I think historically will still look like a major achievement. Because it certainly the yes campaign made ground, the no campaign in a sense had to hold ground, and they managed to hold enough ground to stop things going forward. The rhetoric of a referendum is always interesting. People always want to be campaigning for you to say yes to something usually rather than no. So if there is another referendum, and that's of course on the cards again, now, one of the questions that's currently being explored is what the referendum question should be. The SNP want it to be yes and no again. Their opponents want it to be something different. So how you ask the question is not necessarily neutral either. A tale of two referendums. Here are the results of the EU Brexit referendum, which took place in June 2016. Results by voting area. Basically the blue, the darker the blue is, the more it will show you the Brexit voting and supporting areas, and then the gold colour and the sort of peachy colour is relative levels of support for Remain. And as you can see, there is no blue in Scotland on that result. So the overall vote was very narrow across the whole of the UK, 51.9 to 48.11 on a national turnout of 72%. It was another feature of the Scottish independence referendum that turnout was very high, extremely high, and it was also high here. So famously Leave won, and Britain has, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland has now left the European Union, and we're in a transitional phase. And that has been again a subject of great disappointment and grief to some people, and great jubilation and delight to others. So if you, here's another slide which shows the results of the Brexit referendum, majority Leave and majority Remain, and it's less disaggregated than the other one, and it just shows much more clearly that Scotland is all, in a sense, showing a majority Leave as once you take it up to that level. Northern Ireland is majority Remain. Wales, the areas you'll see where it's yellow, where it was Remain, are also the areas which are the strongholds of Welsh nationalism, and where Welsh language speaking is particularly strong, as well, as Anna will know, because you lived and studied there. Okay. it turns out, I think, that anybody who wants to write about nationalism, that one of the key problems is securing some kind of agreement about what you're actually talking about. It's one of those areas within political science and political theory where definitions are heavily contested. And definitions really matter. So some definitions of nationalism and populism as well come preloaded with what I would call an ethical deficit. Some of you are doing this, I think, as part of an ethics class. So thinking about definitions, in a sense, this is a huge conversation stopper. Because if you say right from the beginning that something is unethical by definition, then it's very difficult to carry on the conversation. So Grosby, in his very short introduction to nationalism, I think it's a disgrace really that he was allowed to publish this in the Oxford series, because I don't think it's a particularly balanced treatment of the issue. But he says, when one divides the world into two irreconcilable and warring camps, one's own nation in opposition to all other nations, where the latter are viewed as one's own implacable enemies, then in contrast to patriotism, and this is a very common trope in these discussions, patriotism good, nationalism bad. And it's also very common within political theology when people talk about it. Then in contrast to patriotism, there is the ideology of nationalism. See, patriotism, he's not calling an ideology either. Nationalism repudiates civility and the differences that it tolerates by attempting to eliminate all differing views and interests for the sake of one vision of what the nation has been and should be. So, well, tell us what you really think. I think that's an unhelpfully a definition which is unhelpfully preloaded with an ethical deficit. And if you start with that definition, well, you're going to have one kind of conversation. Nor do I think that we should try and preload it with an ethical surplus. And it's interesting that Yoram Hazany, an Israeli political theorist, published a book in 2018 called The Virtue of Nationalism. Anybody read that book, The Virtue of Nationalism? And again, I personally struggled with the book. It attracted a lot of attention, but I think you can safely say that every time you were looking for the conversation to break either towards the rights of the Palestinian people or the rights of the Israeli state as currently constituted, he tends to always break towards. He doesn't break towards the Palestinian position, shall we say. But he is interesting. He says, in my father's house, I was taught that to be a nationalist is a virtue. So I put that in there as by way of contrast. You've got Grosby, in a sense, saying nationalism is a vice, and then you've got Hazany saying that nationalism is a virtue. And I want to rely on another theorist to set up the conversation in what I think is a much more helpful way. So Jonathan Hearn is an anthropologist. American or Canadian, I'm not sure. He works at the University of Edinburgh. And he published Rethinking Nationalism in 2006. So he says in this book, I'm just going to introduce you to how he tries to set up the conversation. He says, I don't advance a theory of nationalism and share in the view of many specialists in the field that a single unified theory of nationalism is probably not possible. He talks about how contemporary literature and nationalism, if you've done any reading on this, tends to get divided into two main perspectives. And he says he's reluctant to call them theories. So primordialists tend to believe that nations are kind of ancient entities which you can trace back in time. And then modernist views, Eric Hobsbawm, other people, famously suggest basically that nationalism is essentially invented in the 19th century, 18th and 19th century, and so it's a much more modern phenomenon. In Rethinking Nationalism, Hearn says, I look at the politics of stable democratic regimes as the routinization rather than the overcoming of nationalism. And he says, I want to argue that in stable democratic regimes, this process of nationalism is very deeply embedded in civil society and electoral systems and is not simply an elite or state-led process. It's part of the normal functioning of democratic regimes. He goes on to say, liberal democracies do not so much transcend nationalism as domesticate it, routinizing its dynamic by channeling it through core political institutions. On the one hand, nationalism is seriously altered by this context. It's defanged And I like, you'll see in a minute why I'm interested in that metaphor, and rendered less dangerous. But on the other hand, it's an indispensable aspect of the state's ongoing need for legitimacy and inevitable competition between social groups to define the wider society of which they're members. So his key claim, if you like, is that nationalism is a basic part of how relatively stable democracies legitimate and re-legitimate themselves. In other words, he's kind of saying this is not actually something exotic, and it's not something that's only found in kind of outlandish and kind of extreme regimes. He thinks it's part of how most relatively stable democracies function and legitimate and re-legitimate themselves. And again, he restates this a couple of pages later. He says, far from transcending nationalism, normal Democratic Party politics keeps it on a constant slow boil. And he says that nationalism is an essential resource for the maintenance of legitimacy in democratic regimes which harness and contain, and here again, notice this, its frequently dangerous energies while also utilizing them. Michael Billig, as a theorist of nationalism, is famous for his description of what he calls banal nationalism. One way to understand that is that, like other people's children, other people's nationalism are always more annoying than yours. So Billig, Billig says that, you know, kind of lots of people. So in Scotland, the usual thing is that people are often very, very reluctant to identify themselves as either British nationalists or English nationalists. Maybe the same in Canada, that people will point to the Parti Québécois and say, those nationalists, those separatists. So that's what happens in Scotland, is that the people in the SNP get called nationalists, where people who would make very similar claims about the British state are mostly very reluctant to identify themselves or as nationalists, or be identified with that. He says, Hearn says, reflecting on Hearn, nationalism is not just residual background noise, it's a key legitimizing resource. And he almost sees it as something as well, and this is again where you see the spectrum potentially of how dangerous nationalism can be, as like something where states can have quite a big part in turning the volume up or down on nationalism. And so if you're in a time of war and you need to mobilize people and then you may actually try and crank up, your country needs you, that kind of approach. So that's Hearn, in a sense, trying to say this is not an exotic thing. It's very pervasive and very normal. And so when he comes to advance his definition in Rethinking Nationalism, he invites us to think about nationalism as a series of claims on behalf of a population to identity, jurisdiction, and territory. Now, I found that really helpful because, and I hope it's obvious why, because it neither has an ethical deficit built in, nor does it have an ethical surplus built in. So if you work with Hearn's definition, then you could encounter one kind of nationalism and decide that it was completely unethical and illegitimate and to be rejected and opposed with all of your being. But equally, you might, if it met certain other criteria, say, well, this seems to be a kind of nationalism that I might be prepared to support and endorse, subject to certain qualifications. For me as a theologian, and from the point of view of theological ethics, I liked that because then theological reflection had to develop criteria for assessing what those claims were and whether they were legitimate. And so it appeared to me to set up the conversation in a much more healthy way. Hearn's previously written a book called Claiming Scotland, where he's worked with this conceptuality of claiming. And of course, if you know anything about Scottish history, then this is has powerful resonance. There was a claim of right in 1689, which was part of Scotland, eventually coming to unite behind a new settlement in terms of the Crown, one that would pave the way for the union of the Parliaments in 1707. And this language is language which could be reactivated in times of crisis. So in 1842, the Church of Scotland produced a claim of right when it entered into a major conflict with the British state, which led to something called the Disruption, when the Church of Scotland split into the Free Church and the Church of Scotland over the issue of patronage and the role that the state played in 1842. So that language had already been around, most famously in 1689, and then it was reactivated by the church in a dispute with the state in 1842. And what happened is civil society then took that language on in the campaign for a Scottish Parliament in the 1980s. After the first referendum on devolution, which was defeated, or it wasn't defeated, sorry, it won, but it didn't reach the threshold that had been imposed for the legislation to go through. Then the 80s turned into, there was a lot of campaigning for devolution and for the creation of Scottish Parliament throughout the 80s. And that was across a range of parties. In fact, the SNP were a bit lukewarm about it because it wasn't going far enough for them. But it led to a document which was drawn up by a cross-party constitutional convention in 1989 called A Claim of Right for Scotland. And that formed the basis on which people campaigned for the creation of a Scottish Parliament. 1991, following on from that, there was a feeling that civil society had, the networks and the institutions involved in that had been very male-dominated, and so a women's caucus got together and drew up what they called a Women's Claim of Right for Scotland in 1991, and they produced a document saying, okay, what does this mean for women in Scotland going forward? So there's 4 Claim of Right documents technically, although some are more famous than others. One of the key issues in definition as well, in terms of the ethics of it all, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I try and assess those claims from a theological perspective. But this is David Miller in the Oxford Handbook of Political Theory and his article on nationalism, discussing whether the two political traditions of liberalism and nationalism can ever make peace with one another. So he says, liberal nationalists claim not only that national self-determination can be pursued consistently with liberal principles, but also that liberal values themselves can only be realized in a political community whose members share a common national identity. So I'm not going to go through the whole slide there. But this is an active conversation about, is liberal nationalism a real thing? Is civic nationalism a real thing? Or is it an attempt to synthesize two traditions which are inherently inimical to one another? So I produced a book in the end of 2013, 2014, in the lead up to the referendum, called Honey from the Lion, and the metaphor comes from the Samson story in Judges 14, as many people in this room will know. And I use it in the book as a metaphor for the relationship between power and virtue. I've already mentioned Jonathan Hearn talking about defanging nationalism. And then another Scottish political theorist, Michael Keating, talks about riding the tiger of nationalism. And I talk about honey from the lion. So you can see there's a theme developing here. In other words, that this is potentially a dangerous beast. And of course, if you do Christian theology and know anything about apocalyptic, then the language of beasts has its own particular purchase in relation to ethics. And so Alan Bozak, a South African political activist, famously said, when the state of Romans 13 becomes the beast of Revelation 13, Christians have a duty to oppose it. So the language of the beast there has... Hearn and Keating are more just talking about saying this is, okay, we accept this is a dangerous thing. It has the potential to be dangerous. So some suggested definitions. These are the ones that I work with. That nation denotes the inherited, imagined, constructed, negotiated, and claimed collective identity of a group of people. And you'll see there's a lot of imagined, constructed, negotiated. So you're not hearing a lot of primordial, essentialist language in my definition. And nationalism is the claim to political sovereignty or self-determination in a particular territory based on that identity. So if we move on to theological reflection, as somebody working in the Reformed and Calvinist tradition, I began to develop my theological ethics of nationalism on the basis of a stewardship of cultural diversity. And I used both the story of Eden and the story of Babel as a jumping off point for those things. So first of all, the creation story implies that the equality of all people, and that in racial terms humanity is a single race, and so there is a fundamental assertion of human equality and human unity, I think, that comes through the Christian doctrine of creation. And then the story of Babel, well, it's been read in interestingly diverse ways, and traditionally was read as a kind of curse. But Jacques Ellul, the French Reformed theologian, offered a very interesting reading of the story of the Tower of Babel, where he says, what's the Babel project? He says it's basically the fascist project. It's basically the idea to eliminate all difference and otherness and create a kind of false demonic unity. It's kind of, if you like, ein Volk, ein Reich, you know, and what God does in the story is come down and disrupt that. So what you have here is a providential disruption which gives the human race resources with which they can resist fascism. So it's a really interesting story. In other words, he says it sends you back to the created inheritance of diversity to say that what fascist regimes always try and do is eliminate minorities. They try and eliminate racial minorities. They try and eliminate linguistic minorities. So there was a reading there. Positively, this means a theological assertion that all human culture groups and people groups are both blessed and judged, that God has no favorites. All human languages are valuable, and as Lamin Sani says, the Gambian missiologist, in his famous book Translating the Message, all human languages are authentic destinations for the gospel. All places are both Eden and east of Eden, if you like. Now, I use this word's still on here because it was before Trump got elected, and so I thought I'll use this very clever card metaphor, you know, about what narrative trumping, and of course it hadn't worked out so well for me. But the idea that there are certain stories that trump other stories, and so I'm saying there's a universalist story about who human beings are in creation, and that trumps every other identity story, and I think that's a key claim for Christian ethics. And then, if you start within Christian theology, then your understanding of baptism and the doctrine of the church is also something which cannot be appropriated by any one ethnic group. So the understanding of the Catholicity of the church also trumps and resists all other identity stories. And so my claim was that Reformed theology had to insist on a post-Barman or a post-Belhar theology of the nation. I'm referring there to the Barman Confession, which the confessing church drew up in the Second World War in opposition to Hitler and the Nazi Party, where it asserted the sovereignty of Jesus Christ over all other forms of sovereignty. And if you do political theory and theology, comparing the Barman Confession to the political thought of Schmidt is something which is quite common in these conversations at the moment. So, the other thing I do in the book is I try and set out the idea that there are certain renunciations, and I use the traditional, not for Baptists so much as for more Catholic traditions, baptismal renunciations. In the Catholic and Anglican traditions, when people came to be baptized, they would be asked, do you renounce the world, the flesh, and the devil? I don't think Baptists would disagree with renouncing those things. It's just not your usual practice. And so I suggest in the book that one way to think about the crucial things that need to be renounced are to use the world, the flesh, and the devil. In other words, that the lion has to be broken open. There has to be a kind of breaking of nationalism. It has to be required to give up certain claims and turn away from certain claims. And the first one is imperialism. So it has to renounce domination, invasion, superiority, and practice equal regard and equal recognition. So there's a kind of analogy with neighbor love as a principle there. Then it has to renounce essentialism. So the law of blood, in a sense, has to be replaced by the law of territory there. William McIlvanney, the Scottish writer, famously said at a rally for independence, "We are a mongrel nation." And I think that's been very, very significant, because the opposite of that is to try and claim some kind of ethnic purity and say, you're not really as Scottish as me. because, your name's Gay and your dad's an Englishman, and whereas I'm a Mackay of the Clan Mackay, and I have the kilt to prove it, and I trace my roots back to Bonnie Prince Charlie. My Scottish history prof, T.C. Smout, said lots of North Americans used to write to him and say, I believe that we're descended from Bonnie Prince Charlie. And he said, I was always tempted to write back and say, actually, you're the illegitimate, your great-great-grandfather was the illegitimate son of a goat herder in Fife. So this is the opposite of that. It's the idea of being a mongrel nation, or from South Africa, famously Desmond Tutu and others talking about the rainbow nation. In political theory, people sometimes talk about fuzzy nationalism. In other words, you're not drawing rigid boundaries around the nation here. This is a porous thing in terms of it's open to naturalization. You can become Scottish. You can become Canadian within this view of it. And those are hybrid things. And so hyphenated, so African Canadian or Pakistani Canadian, or what we call New Scots in Scotland, the idea of people being Pakistani Scots or Turkish Scots or Anglo-Scots. And the final thing is to renounce absolutism, and that national sovereignty exists under divine sovereignty. So, in other words, the Barman Confession started with the affirmation of the Lordship of Christ, and basically said, because Christ was Lord, Hitler could not be given the place that people were trying to claim for him. And so no Christian can ever say, my country, right or wrong, because all of the identity claims of your political regime or your country within Christian theology, I argue, have to be brought under the Lordship of Christ. How am I doing for time? Okay. The other place I went to think about this was to Augustine and to the City of God. And a very famous passage in the City of God where, and we've been talking a lot about Augustine this week because we've been talking about love and affect and desire and disordered loves. And I'm going to say a little bit more about this passage tonight in tonight's lecture. But this famous passage from chapter 19, section 19 of City of God, if we are to discover the character of any people, we have only to examine what it loves. If it is an assembled multitude of rational creatures and is united by a common agreement as to what it loves, then it's not absurd to call it a people, no matter what the objects of its love may be. So first of all, in a sense, he's arguing a common love that binds people together, in a sense, might be enough to constitute them as a people. But you've then, to assess it ethically, you've got to say, what is it that they love, though? Because they could love the dream of a 1,000-year Reich, or they could love white supremacy. So what is it that they love? Because then he says, the better the objects of the agreement, the better the people, and the worse the objects, the worse the people. So Rowan Williams and other people have written about Augustine, John Milbank, a number of other people. And therein lies a lot of, I think, the issue about what do I love? And Augustine famously said, what do I love when I love God? A key question. Hugh MacDiarmid, one of our most famous poets, says, the rose of all the world is not for me. I want for my part only the little white rose of Scotland that smells sharp and sweet and breaks the heart. Now, it's an interesting poem, because you could argue there's something lovely about it. It's about being content to love something small and local, and not to overclaim for it. But then Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak says, where and how does the love of mother tongue, the love of my little corner of ground, become the nation thing, from her book Nationalism and the Imagination? That's a really interesting question. I think the tension between those two things. And I think an Augustinian understanding of a kind of a theology of desire and love opens up a way to think about that. Something I've not said, and I want to just, I want to mention it, is that for Christian theology, when I started to work on this, I found it quite hard to find people who were doing the kind of thing that I was intending to do in terms of a sort of defense of nationalism, of the possibilities of an ethical nationalism. And but it was interesting because a lot of theological treatments of it seemed to me to still be working off of the Second World War and the experience of the Second World War, and in particular the critique of fascism and of Nazism, and still our university chaplain back in Glasgow, who's a staunch Labour supporter, still accuses me of supporting the Scottish Nazi Party. Yeah, he's not the most discreet of people, but he does it in public and on Twitter and things. So, he's a robust guy, so he can take care of himself. But what happened subsequently, though, was there were two waves in which there was the rehabilitation, a kind of rehabilitation of nationalism that went on. And I think it's interesting just to take account of those as well. So the first of those relates to the process of decolonization. So if you move from the end of the Second World War and you look at the next 2 decades, the number of member states in the United Nations, and of course they still call it United Nations at the end of the war, it begins to increase dramatically as the process of decolonization takes place. And where the former colonial territories declare independence, very often what you see is the struggle against the colonial power takes the form of a kind of nationalist struggle. And so that's, if you like, the beginnings of a kind of rehabilitation of the discourse of nationalism, I think, because it's appropriated within decolonization struggles. And then the second wave, if you like, of a potential rehabilitation of it, and I think theology hasn't really caught up with these, is obviously the post-1989 world, where a similar thing happens in response to the breakup of the Soviet Union, an authoritarian kind of imperial project. As that unravels, then you get a reassertion of nationalist discourses as people resist the power of the Soviet Union and undo that project. And so, part of my argument was that I didn't think theological ethics had caught up with theologizing those, certainly not in the West. So I'd set out some theopolitical criteria, and I'm on the home run here, for judging nations and nationalism. Do they accept universal narratives of human equality and diversity? Are they willing to make the key renunciations that I spoke about? Do they enable better objects of love? So one of our arguments in Scotland at the moment is that we believe we could build a better country, a fairer country, and a more just society if we were independent and had self-determination. That's the claim anyway. Internally, do they enable a politics of the common good for all citizens and residents? And all citizens and residents. So here's a key test, what do other minorities, particularly people of colour, what view do they take of your nationalist project? Are they supportive of it, or are they deeply suspicious of it because they feel it's against them? Now, I would argue that in relation to English nationalism and Scottish nationalism, there are two very different scripts running, and you just have to look at the voting patterns in relation to Brexit. Areas like London, which are heavily multicultural, vote to remain. Areas where there's been a white backlash against migration, in many cases, have voted to leave. So, a politics of the common good for all citizens. Externally, do they enable relations of peace and security? And also, let's talk about neighbours. Would they lead to negative outcomes for your neighbours? Would it impoverish one of your neighbours? Or there are various countries, for example, where nationalist movements have all of the oil or all of the mineral resources in their part of the country, and they want to declare independence and potentially remove access to that wealth for another part of the country. So, there are issues there. And is the pursuit of their goals compatible with positive goals for the international community? Polity making, I think, is a really interesting, in some ways, I think it's under-theorized as well within political science as well. But, there is literature around state building and that has proved to be a very difficult enterprise in the last 20 or 30 years. But this idea of policy making I find interesting. The Goldilocks principle. So British Unionists tend to say that Scotland's too small and Europe's too big, but the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is just right. And Aristotle talked about the need for political entities to be big enough to defend themselves, but not so big that they became remote and people couldn't identify with them. So my argument is that we need things which are, that when we talk about unions, they should be fluid and provisional, and in the words of, is it Gwyneth Paltrow, they should be open to conscious uncoupling. But I also suggest an analogy here, and this is where within Christian ethics I want to talk about discipleship. So I want to suggest that you have to learn, just as you have to learn how to be human within discipleship, you have to learn how to be Canadian, and you have to learn how to be Scottish or Nigerian or English, and that is a process of discipleship. You're a steward of your identity, and it's possible that you can perform that identity in better ways or in worse ways, as Augustine suggests. I want to suggest that Brexit has been driven largely by quite a toxic performance of undiscipled Anglo-British nationalism. Whereas I think Scottish nationalism has had 100 years of evolution as a civic, liberal and radical discourse and performance. And that's one of the reasons why, on the whole, minorities, people of colour in Scotland tend to be broadly supportive of independence as opposed to the opposite being the case in relation to Brexit. Here's an example. I don't know if you saw these over here. There's a group of right-wing newspapers in the UK, and here are some of the headlines produced during the Brexit campaign. Foreign murderers and rapists we can't throw out. Migrants shun the English language. Immigration, the backlash. You pay to teach migrants manners. Migrants set to flood in. How Romanian criminals terrorise our streets. Enough is enough. Send them all back home. We must stop the migrant invasion. And this was one of the big posters during the Brexit campaign. Breaking point, the EU has failed us all. So look at the messaging that's going on there. What was interesting about the two campaigns and the difference between them, Scotland tried to produce this extensive 400-page booklet, evidence-based case for independence. And of course what happened was immediately all the critics fell upon it and tried to rip it apart. And that's okay. That's kind of the game. That's what should happen. You produce a case and see whether it stands up to scrutiny. What was very interesting about Brexit was that people learned from that, and they said, you were stupid enough to run a campaign where you tried to expose it to rational argument. Brexit was about affect. And this is where this links into what Brexit was affective politics. They used the Trumpian playbook, and it was all about managing people's feelings. Take back control. And I would say the messaging was heavily dog whistle in relation to immigration, and it was about mobilizing a kind of white consciousness in many ways against immigration. Let me go on. Two things I want to show you as I finish. That's the poll trend lines. For green is support for independence, red is no. So you see the long-term convergence, and now the range in the middle is 45 to 55. So it's the margin of defeat in the 2014 independence campaign. And so now you see at the end there is a trend line which is fairly established, which has been closing the gap. And that's one of the reasons for that is because during the 2014 campaign, those who were opposed to Scottish independence, including David Cameron, campaigned very heavily. They said, if you vote yes, you will be thrown out of the European Union. If you vote no, you'll be allowed to stay in the European Union with the rest of us. And that was a huge issue for many people in the campaign. And some of us said, if we vote no, then what will happen is we will be taken out of the union against our will. The hour in that is what we might want to talk about, by a majority of English voters. And of course, that's what happened in the Brexit referendum. Scotland voted to remain, England voted to leave. Scotland gets taken out because it's a smaller part of the equation. That's so initially people had said in the first referendum, this is a once in a generation decision. And that has been quoted back against the SNP a lot. And what happened, the SNP was then said, well, if there is a material change in circumstances, we reserve the right to bid for another referendum. And so the argument from the SNP is that being taken out of the EU through Brexit represents just such a material change of circumstances. So that's where we're up to bring us right up. Scenarios for the future, and this is what I close on. Harold Macmillan famously said, "Events, dear boy, events," when he was asked what guided. And there's always something to be said for that. Particularly at the moment, there's an argument that we may have reached peak SNP in Scotland. So in the last week, there's been a major scandal involving the finance minister. And also we're about to go into a trial where the former leader of the SNP and First Minister of Scotland, Alex Salmond, is being trialed for put on trial for various sexual offences that he's alleged to have committed, including rape. And the predictions are that this will not go well. So these two very powerful men who are seen to have abused their positions may end up damaging the wider cause of the SNP. There are also some internal splits over Indy Ref 2 tactics. Some people want to declare an illegal or an unauthorised referendum and hold it in Scotland. Other people are saying that didn't work out too well in Catalonia. So let's keep our eyes on that. There's also an interesting radical split on the left of the SNP between gender-critical feminists and those who are in support of radical action on trans identity. And it seems like, in some ways, it might seem like an obscure argument, but it's proving very divisive within the party. There's also the incumbency. The SNP have already stayed remarkably popular, given their incumbency. They've stayed at the top for a long time, and the rule usually is that gravity will affect you at some point as a political party. Their record on health and education is subject to a lot of criticism at the moment, although on the whole, they're doing better on health outcomes than the English system is. How Brexit's going to work out. So if Boris Johnson and the others make a huge success of Brexit, despite many of our scepticism about that, that will have a big impact, I think. We don't know yet because nothing much has changed because we're still in the transition agreement till the end of December. So we'll have to wait and see what happens by that. The other thing is the effectiveness of the other parties. The other political parties in Scotland have been very poor in the last 2 decades on the whole. And so they've not had much competition. 2 other things. What's going to happen to Britishness? I suspect the major litmus test for this will be seeing what happens to the country as the Queen dies. And the Queen is going to die at some point, I would think, well, fairly soon. Given that she's now, sadly, she's the same age as my mum, and my mum's still alive as well. And I'm kind of braced for both things. I'm actually more worried about my mum, I have to say. But this will be a major thing. And it will mean something in Canada as well, I think. The Queen is extremely popular globally. And she's extremely popular in the UK as well, particularly amongst older generations. But she's also reasonably popular amongst young people as well. Charles is not nearly as popular. So unless it skips a generation, and there are some signs that William could become more unpopular as well. But I think that's going to be an interesting test of Britishness, because you could argue that the Queen is part of the glue of the Union at the moment, and once she goes, I think she'll be mourned significantly in Scotland, but in the aftermath, I think those who come after her may not be as popular, and their stickiness may not be as strong in terms of the bonds. And then also the future of Englishness. There was a famous political science article that described English nationalism as the dog that would not bark. But what's interesting is that although it's been Brexit and Britain and Union Jacks, for most people there is a strong admission. And read Fintan O'Toole's book about Brexit, if you, wonderful Irish commentator, if you want a quite searing exploration of that. That Englishness now is being weaponized and is becoming a much more militant expression of identity. And so the future of what happens around that, and then also time, because demographics show a strong level of support for independence in Scotland amongst younger people. So I hope that's given you some kind of introduction, both to the state of the debate in Scotland and to how I've approached it in my own work on it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Doug. As I invite the panel to come to the sofa, and I'm going to invite Geoffrey really to respond first, I think, to have first go at this. But while they're transitioning into that position, feel free to stand up and give a good stretch, and so you can get all the juices flowing, because I think it's going to be a good discussion. Well, folks, I think we're just about ready. If you would like to gather back in again and take your seats or wander about the back, whatever's most comfortable for you. I can't wait to see how this conversation is going to unfold. I have to declare an interest. I am a British passport holder, and so I'm not disinterested in the topic that's being discussed, and have some of my own opinions and actually quite strong feelings around it that are not at all anti-Scottish, but but maybe pro-British. We'll see how that would go. But I'm not going to monopolize this conversation, because we have a great political mind amongst us in Geoffrey Whitehall. And Geoffrey, I'd like you to really just kick off the discussion with what your response is to what you've heard Doug say today.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, great.
The array mics are pretty good.
Are really good? Okay, that's too bad. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this. And I feel like this is a community that I don't normally participate in, so I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to participate in this conversation. I'm someone who studies political theory and international politics, but I'm not someone who sits in the middle of those two, doing a little bit of international relations on one side or international politics on one side, and then political theory as a side gig on the other. On the contrary, I'm a political theorist who is quite hostile to the notion of the nation. And so I see the international project as something that is quite limited in terms of what we could imagine our world to be, and what a limited way of thinking about how we could be together. So I'm already probably operating in that category of thinking that the nation has an ethical deficit, and I think that I'm not going to try to convince you of that that the nation has a national or an ethical deficit. But what I am going to say, I think, is that I think a community of compassion and a community organized around questions of suffering could do better off with other concepts than that of the nation, which carries such incredible baggage with it, and incredible risks and dangers, that if we truly hold on to those questions of compassion and suffering, that we shouldn't risk the dangers that come with the beast or the lion or the tiger and so on. That these are really these times are an opportunity which are at one moment quite scary, because we do see the rise in radical nationalism around the world. And there are many cases that are not simply in Canada and Scotland or even in Europe and so on. We see forms of radical nationalism emerging in Brazil, India, all across Eastern Europe and so on, Russia, as well as United States. America First is a similar kind of principle. And so in the midst of that, right, this is a time where we would probably want to be quite cautious about embracing the concept of nation. It would probably also, and I take this to be the point of this lecture, an opportunity for us to rethink it and reformulate it and see where it can go. I think that that's a valuable project. But I do think that it's a project that there's another alternative to embracing the nation and reformulating it. And it would involve a considerable amount of political imagination to engage in a practice of opening our imaginative horizons. And it may require that we go back to some older traditions and recognize the baggage that is connected to the nation. So, for instance, if we were to think about one of the moments that was identified in the lecture of where there was a reformed attitude around the nation being decolonization, we can look to other forms of political mobilization that happened at that time as well. There was a movement of Pan-Africanism, which sought not to seek forms of self-determination in a national form, but in fact looked at forms of commonality that wasn't going to reproduce the colonial boundaries of a state that had been inherited. That project ran up against the shores of nationalism and really failed to reach its potential precisely because of nationalism. Similarly, there's an unaligned movement which came at a similar period in terms of the mobilization of, in that case, decolonized states or anti-colonial states, and seeking other forms of political community that didn't reproduce forms of international politics. So I think the challenge before us is a little wider than just simply, is there a way for us to think about the nation as, is there a redemptive element to the nation? Can we forgive the nation for its ills and its sins and so on? I think that we may be able to find better forms of community that allow us to achieve other forms of connection than what the nation provides to us. So will be my opening comments.
Great, thank you, Geoffrey. We'll bring Spencer in a minute, but I want to ask a question, probably starting with you, Geoffrey, because it's a very Canadian question, which is when we think about what it means to be Canadian, there seems to be multiple narratives that are told. We're given one narrative that appears on advertisements around the Olympics that tells us that we are an inclusive nation, we're a diverse nation, and we kind of seem to buy this idea and what it means to fly the Canadian flag. But then we also see First Nation at the moment just being completely disenfranchised in every human way on the West Coast. And so how do we, is there any point, does this feed into your idea that we need to think of alternative forms when we think about First Nations within what we understand to be a nation state of Canada, for example?
Yeah, again, I think that, when it's quite convincing when presented in a particular way that there is a good and a bad side of nationalism. And again, using this, there's a possibility for patriotism, there's a possibility for good feeling of some sort. And the reason why that exists is because we already exist within these communities. We have already engaged in these forms of association, and those forms of association have benefited us in different kinds of ways. So to think about it at a more abstract kind of level, you would then probably, and probably in a historical kind of, so abstract in terms of theoretical, but historical in terms of concrete specifics, you would likely find that the opposition between ethical deficit and ethical surplus are not in fact opposites, that they are in fact united in the concept of nation, and that the nation always carries with it a violent side that's exclusionary, and always makes claims to forms of inclusion. But the question that you will, I think, find at the end of every single conversation in that order is who has to be excluded in order for you to be included. Right? And it's this, even if it's an inclusion, even if it's an open society like Canada, makes all these series of claims, there will always be a border. There's a territorializing aspect of the nation that cannot be forgotten. That rights, even rights are articulated in terms of who has access to those rights. And so then the conversations eventually come down to the question of do you or do you not belong? And the question, and I think that's a dangerous question for if we're interested in having conversations about compassion and commitment to ending forms of suffering and so on. The fact that there's that seed at the heart of the question of the nation makes it impossible for us to fully engage in those forms. Those forms of violence, and I use that language very specifically, will manifest themselves in other places. So we can have peace inside, justice inside, the rule of law inside, but at some moment there will be an edge. And all of those sublimated, all those suppressed elements of violence and so on will then manifest themselves either through military, through borders, through forms of exclusion, through forms of collective trauma. And so again, that doesn't mean that that's the only way that we can go, but it's a harder road to start to imagine forms of association and community that don't end up reproducing those forms of violences, and would probably embrace many of the things that Doug has articulated in terms of renunciation of essentialism, renunciation of absolutism, renunciation of imperialism. It just may not take the form of a nation. So I think that we are exactly, particularly in Canada at this moment, facing a kind of hypocrisy of a claim to a nation that is inclusive and that in its charter, right, in the Constitution, in Section 35, Section 25, recognizes Aboriginal title and Aboriginal self-governance as what it means to be Canadian. It's our responsibility as Canadians, because we come from that Constitution, to defend those rights as our own, even though they aren't ours, in terms of I'm not an Indigenous person. But I have an obligation because of the Constitution to defend those as if they were mine, because it's the condition which gives rise to my form of association. We in fact find the Canadian government, well, we'll see what happens, actively undermining those very claims. So that's the moment of hypocrisy. That's the really difficult question that we have to face. And again, I'll put it as a form is, should we dedicate our energies to reforming the nation, or should we dedicate our energies to reimagining forms of association which don't reproduce those same kinds of violences?
I find it fascinating for all kinds of reasons, not least because I've spent a lot of time in the past with Reinhold Niebuhr, who would suggest that from a Christian perspective, anytime we gather communally, our sins are in some ways magnified, and so the kinds of things that you're talking about, conflict, violence, and so on, becomes an extension of our worst selves when we're in community. And so I'm always interested in is that the only outcome of community, or is there a different way? And he thought the nation was kind of, the best and the worst of all of that. Yeah. But are there, how do we overcome those same impulses in a different form of community? So it'd be really fascinating to unpack that. But I want to make sure, Spencer, that you have an opportunity to come in on this. So what are your thoughts on what's going around?
What I did two things, just sort of reflecting here. I wrote down just sort of what are our nationalist quests within Canada that they just sort of bear listing. And then I looked at this as how does the quest for determination and freedom, very central to who we are as Baptists, and since we're listening to a Presbyterian and everything else, so I'll do both of those.
And an atheist.
An atheist. There's an interest in political theology too, which is just sort of like,
You're so welcome here.
Yeah. I thought Doug did a really great job at saying that nationalism is a neutral thing. It has to have criteria. That was very helpful to me. Because as I wrote down this list, you think there are ones that are quests that are good and amicable and others that are problematic. So I thought of 6 that I see within Canada. One, a political formation that was important for me was George Grant. Does anybody know George Grant? Anybody read him? He taught at Dalhousie for a number of years. Very instrumental in forming the largely eroded Red Tory tradition within Canadian conservatism. At the time of his writing, around the Diefenbaker era, he was worried about Canada getting dissolved into the United States, particularly the United States culture of corporatization and its war agenda. And so he wanted to consolidate a Canadian nationalist identity that was somehow other than that. And he had various criteria of what that was. So I think that's one nationalism we have within Canada. How do we be ourselves apart from what we see as corrosive elements of American culture? And not that it's entirely corrosive, of course. I have a lot of American family. The second one I see, as we already mentioned, was Quebec. Quebec sovereignty, Quebec quest for determination in the referendum. What we've lately seen was something very problematic, where you see the enshrinement of secularism law. And I find this, as a Christian, very troubling, because the secularism laws are very hypocritical, because Christian symbols are then equated with the cultural heritage and then are given a free pass, whereas a hijab is then seen as offensive and needs to be taken down. I don't like that as a Christian. I don't like being privileged in that way. And so I have a big problem with that kind of project. You see here in this particular instance, ethnicity and culture heavily coincide with land in a very problematic way. And so I think we need to discuss that more. 3 was sort of hovering in the last election. We see coming up from the United States to a degree, a nationalism pulling around the Libertarian Party led by Maxime Bernier, where it was odd to see how his convictions of libertarianism, resisting big government, ended up forming a front or a comfortable way of associating, so that somebody who was deeply xenophobic could engage in their convictions without censorship, or had to be able to prioritize themselves without wanting to be accountable to critiques of climate change or the need to respond to the refugee crisis. It was interesting how that formed almost a manifestation point. 4th, I see now, also very important in the last election, was the Wexit movement. Interestingly, patterned after the Brexit terminology. The quest of the West to have its oil, as you mentioned, be able to get out to sea, and with the pipeline, and the ability to culminate a resentment, a huge political energy to try to resist taxation around carbon, resist attempts at talking about what the ramifications of this pipeline would be. 5, I had to put this down. We see Christian nationalism, particularly attempts to want to reclaim Canada as a Christian nation. I hear that all the time in popular preaching, reclaiming the nation. I usually find this very problematic, because it's completely dismissive or ignorant of the fact that Indigenous people were here first, and that we're not really, in some sense, while we do have a cultural heritage of Christianity, whether or not it reflects our present, whether or not that actually admits to what the realities of the Indigenous nations are in our midst, I think is very problematic. And that leads into my 6th, the quest for First Nations self-determination, which we already mentioned. Now we're seeing a very volatile situation play out with the Wet'suwet'en and in BC. And so they're claimed as a nation within a larger nation, and how that's now at loggerheads within the courts and everything else. So I see those are 6 that I see. I think there's obviously much more, but I think those are 6 that I've seen. The next I saw, so I just sort of reflected on this nationalism is a quest of self-determination, a quest of freedom, a quest of liberty. That's a very endearing word for a Baptist. You could say a Baptist, at least in one traditional characterization of what a Baptist is about freedom. Freedom in a few ways. Freedom to gather before the Word and to interpret as one's conscience is led. Freedom to determine the worship of our churches as autonomous entities. Freedom of religion, largely, and then culminating in this principled separation of church and state. When it comes to thinking about freedom, though, I always ask myself, is this a critique of Baptist identity? It's freedom for what? Freedom for what? Fundamentalism as well as a kind of hard liberalism often have a kind of freedom that's from or freedom against. Fundamentalism, it's a freedom against intellectual critique, away from that, isolation, not wanting to be accountable to, or projects that want to be against. It's trying to culminate that kind of freedom. I would hope as a moderate Baptist would try to be freedom for something, freedom with something, freedom that admits our interconnectedness. And I think this forms something, an analogous logic for how we think about states, national governments. Is it just, and you did this well to point this out, that it's freedom that recognizes everybody, freedom that recognizes the dignity of all people, freedom that doesn't want to see my freedom as at loggerheads or a zero-sum game with somebody else's freedom. It's freedom with. And so freedom as a Christian it has this sort of two prongs in it. It has to be our choice, it has to be my volition, but it's a recognition that I'm always freer with something, for something, along with my community. It's not an individualization. It admits that all people have dignity and how our immediate community can't be propped up at the expense of another. And how we have to work nationally, I guess, then for peace of everyone, not just our community first and my autonomy first. So you see that freedom for, freedom with, rather than freedom from and freedom against. What does that mean for certain nationalisms? You can see how that understanding of freedom can go different ways. And I think this all sort of lands the plane with thinking about Brexit and Scottish nationalism. There's a quest of freedom of determination on both accounts, and then there's this question of interconnectedness of both. How bounded is Scotland to the rest of the UK? How bound is the UK to the rest of Europe? I think we also have to ask ourselves, how bound are we towards others, whether as Christians to non-Christians in a community, as one community to another, as nations to the world? How can we be freedom with each other? How can we have freedom with each other? And that has to be factored into our questions of self-determination. And those are my two
Thanks,
bundles
Spencer.
of thoughts, I guess.
I can't help but segue from that in some ways back to what you said, Doug, about how do we determine better loves.
Yeah.
And I was sitting there asking, of course, the same question that would always be asked: who determines what a better love is? And I quickly looked up the stat because I had a guess, and what I found was that anywhere 96% of Scotland is white. So who determines what a better love is in the context of Scottish nationalism, for example?
I mean, that's where I think that bringing the project of self-determination, the project of nationalism that I was talking about, explicitly into conversation with what you're talking about. And when I was trying to say that, I thought that Scottish nationalism had been disciplined by 100 years of conversation. Hugh McDermott, the poet I quoted there, was expelled from the Communist Party of Scotland in the 1920s for being a nationalist, and expelled simultaneously from the National Party of Scotland for being a communist. But what was interesting about that was it represented in that discourse the idea that nationalism and internationalism were not zero-sum games. And so this has been very important, I think, within the evolving discourse of Scottish nationalism, the idea that internationalism was was you had to be both a nationalist and an internationalist. Now, so to have a set of another set of ethical criteria around communities which mitigate suffering and which promote well-being, and to set those as universal goals and ambitions, and to name those as the criteria for better loves, if you like. I don't have any problem with that at all. My comeback to you, and you're probably expecting this, I'm sure, would be the idea that this is an overly utopian and cosmopolitan ambition, and it doesn't reflect the conditions within which people actually live at the moment. So the issue for us is now, how long would we have to wait if we felt we were within a dysfunctional state which was distorting our priorities socially and economically? How long do we have to wait before we can reconfigure the world around communities, transnational communities of justice and compassion which mitigate suffering? And also, what's I think that these things perhaps have to coexist, and I think that was where my pushback against you was. Is it not in the same way that, for example, Mandela and the others in the ANC ended up having to have pan-nationalist ideas coexist with, if you like, the need to overturn apartheid in that one country and to mobilize people for a struggle within the boundaries of South Africa as they existed? So I suppose my question would be, why do you feel that this, in a sense, involves a repudiation of the nationalism? How long are people meant to wait, either under apartheid or anything else, or within a union that they don't like, before you could give some kind of practical political expression to that as a project that might then begin to make a difference to people? And therefore, why would you not, in a sense, be more persuaded by my position, which is to say, let's run these things alongside one another, and try and keep the discourse of the nation heavily accountable to a transnational discourse about mitigating suffering? And I would say that I source that. You may source it, within a more humanist perspective. I source it within Christian theology, but we'd probably have a huge overlap in what we believe that to be about.
Is that a challenge?
I think you're giving the opportunity to come back on that, Geoff.
Yeah. So let's start with the question, I think the powerful question of, because I think it will shift the conversation slightly. And it's your question, which is who gets to decide? And I think that that question, who gets to decide, is the question that we're really struggling with. Because it's, so at one level we're having a conversation about nationalism in the nation. But there's actually, I think, a more fundamental concept that's underlying this, which is why I keep pointing to the problem of violence, and that's the question of sovereignty. Mm-hmm. And sovereignty in this is this force that's lurking behind questions of nationalism. If there was if we take sovereignty and territoriality away from nation, then you have community. You have a Dungeons and Dragons group. You have forms of association that get together because they love certain kinds of things, but there's very little kind of political implication to that, to those forms of association. What makes this a political question, or what makes this a question with great stakes, is precisely the question of sovereignty, of who gets to decide. And that question of sovereignty is something which you all know about in a different language than probably I would know about. Because you probably think about the sovereignty of Jesus, you think about the sovereignty of God, you think about the sovereignty of the church in ways which are different than the way in which, say, a political scientist thinks about the sovereignty of a state. And the very fact that you are open to thinking about competing sovereignties is a radical notion. because within the political science community, there is no other sovereignty other than the sovereignty of the state. Now, what's interesting about that is that through conversations of political theology and so on, is that the sovereignty of the state, which appears to stand as a secular tradition, is in fact deeply indebted to a theological conversation. And so the indebtedness of the modern sovereign state is really gets wrapped up into a bunch of stuff that you know much more about than I do. The problem of evil. How is it that you're going to reconcile this question? It goes deeper in terms of questions of chaos versus order, or how that got reformulated into questions of good and evil, or contingency and permanence, us against them. All of these binary formations that we are struggling with today in terms of forms of exclusion are in some forms manifestation of older conversations that have either the argument on the one hand is that we live in secularized theological concepts and we just don't acknowledge it. That's one kind of interpretation. Or that we live in moments of that concepts have been recuperated and put to other ends. Now I see that the attempt to recuperate a concept from the past and put it to a different end is a useful, it's something that, because we're in the midst of the world, we're in the midst of living already, we can't help but do, and we will always engage in those practices. So you're not going to be able to get rid of nationalism overnight, and the charge of what then is your alternative is an unfair one, to say the least. It's a powerful move but it's a move that I think is actually quite consistent with the question that I started off with for you all, which is that we need to engage in the kind of exercise of stretching our political imaginary. Now, in terms of the question, because that sets, for ourselves the task of at least thinking about that, whether or not we are successful or not, we provided ourselves with a different horizon of forms of political association and community and so on. So that's a difficult task for us to do, but minimally it should be there. When we get to the question of concrete politics, is that me?
Might be, I think.
Yeah, that does sound like me. Just going on and on and on. Sorry about that. Okay, so you do have this utopic kind of order, a set of questions about the political imaginary that I think is our responsibility to think about. In terms of actual expediency, in terms of a kind of politics, I don't think that we need to set our sights too far away from the question of resistance. And that's a strange kind of thing to say, that it's the day-to-day struggle. It's the form of resistance that one engages in terms of confronting and dealing with the harshness of nationalism, the critique of the forms of oppression that and problems that are identified for Canada, and so it's precisely in the engagement and resistance to that I will put my $10 on in terms of saying that's where we are going to find new forms of association. That is precisely in and through resistance, in and through building coalition conversations and so on, that there will be manifest forms of community that we should then amplify, affirm, and work to articulate, speak about, and so on. And it's those forms of association that are born out of struggle, that are born out of contest, that we should be getting behind instead of questions of the nation. I think that nationalist projects, I think that we would forget our history if we didn't think about the incredible tragedy of third world nationalism and the ways in which those nationalist projects have ended up in dictatorial forms and in situations which have led to absolute forms of oppression and domination. And I don't necessarily know whether or not South Africa is a better example at this particular moment than the historical ones. So I think that, I think that is our dual task. One is to think a broader horizon, and the other one is to engage in immediate moments and constitute new forms of community in and through resistance in the here and now. I don't know how those two things come together.
Well, see, they do, I think, because,
Okay, great.
I mean, for us as Baptists,
Yeah.
you're speaking our language,
Oh,
right?
great, okay.
I mean, who knew, right?
Say a community.
Because we've been talking this week even about how we are
It's love in
formed.
between the atheists and the Baptists.
It took a Presbyterian to forge the conversation. No, we've been talking for ages. But how you become a community of resistance as followers of Christ, because there are liturgies that are forming us all over the place. That's what Doug's been talking about this week. We're formed by all of these. I mean, whether nationalism is a reaction against globalization, for example, I mean, I think becomes part of that question. And Baptists in our history, we should know that we resist the legislation of the magistrate. That's what birthed us as dissenters. That still should be who we are, but somewhere along the line we got cozy with the state, but that's not who we are, because we claim the lordship of Christ over all creation. Then that's who we answer to. We don't answer to the magistrate, and so any forms of nationalism and governments that make claim on us that would compete with that larger sovereignty is an issue that I think in some ways we've forgotten who we are, and the call to resist. See, now that I really like, because if we're talking about how are we formed then in counter formations to the multinational formations that have such a hold on the world, there's potential, I think, in those communities for resistance, for counter formations, even though I think at the moment they're quite weak. And so I would also want to push back to say, is the nationalist project the one we really want to be spending time with and attention to, if we're really to find those communities of resistance? Which brings me back then to where we started. As a British passport holder, if you're going to be interested in the goods of all, there are many of us who were immigrants into the UK for a number of years, and we come from all different places, and we never saw ourselves as Welsh or English or Scottish. And with the breakup of the UK, there's a whole lot of people left almost nationless in a way, because we saw ourselves as British within Europe. If you asked me when I lived in Wales, did I feel Welsh? Well, clearly not. I lived amongst Welsh nationalists. I clearly was not Welsh. In England, when I see myself as never English. No, I'm not English. But my British, I had a sense of what that was. And when I was with Welsh nationalists, it was clear that I did not belong. Same amongst Scottish nationalists, to be honest. So I just wonder if you have a response to any of that.
Yeah, I think I already made that response though, because I think I am saying absolutely, come on in. We want you to belong, because this is a hybrid, porous understanding of nationality. And I was preaching recently on the story of Ruth and Naomi, and it's very interesting because it begins with a famine in Bethlehem, and so Naomi and Elimelech travel to Moab, and they are received there in Moab for a while, and then the story is very clever. The narrative is very clever because first of all, Naomi is the migrant and who's welcomed in Moab, and then Ruth is the migrant who's welcomed in Bethlehem, and there is so this idea of, I think if you went to Plaid Cymru today, unless you were talking to some real extremists, people would say absolutely you can become a Welsh nationalist.
But you have, it's a feeling whether you belong or not. And if I walk in a room and everyone is speaking Welsh, and I love the Welsh, I loved being there. But if everyone is speaking Welsh and they look at you and say, well, you will never learn to speak Welsh, even if you learn to speak Welsh, you don't belong.
Well, if they said you will never learn to speak Welsh, but it's interesting at the moment, there's a project, Duolingo, Duolingo, the thing where you learn language, they've just put Gaelic on, and so there's a big kind of project about learning Gaelic via Duolingo, not because it's ever going to become the dominant language, but the way in which I think the cultural sector in Scotland engaged with this was very significant. We have a festival called Celtic Connections, and this is all about fusion, it's about hybridity, it's about overlap, it's about conversation, and the idea of a Scottishness which is self-confident enough, in a sense, to want to take part in this economy of exchange, of celebrating one another's identities. So there's also, I think, I don't disagree with you about a community of compassion, but I also think there's other possible areas in which we could reimagine what identity could be at a collective level. And I absolutely don't think it's an unfair question to ask you about the practical. Because I still go back to this question: how long? How long do you wait for these new configurations to take shape? And where is the evidence that they are going to, to put all your eggs in the basket of resistance, as opposed, in a sense, and this is a real Baptist Reformed division. Like, do we think we should try and run stuff? And historically, Anabaptists have said no. We're just going to resist. And the places that gets absurd is when you get Mennonites in Paraguay hiring non-Mennonite security guards to protect their farms, so that they can do the whacking of people on the head that the Mennonites don't want to do, which is a little bit sometimes where, in Glasgow, Jewish families used to sometimes hire Gentile kids to come up the stairs and turn the lights on and off. At some point, you've got to take responsibility for the fact you either sit in the darkness or you turn your own lights on and off. And same with the Mennonites, you either say we're going to have a police force here, or you can't just be kind of freeload on other people who take the hard decisions about running stuff, maybe in a more Augustinian way. So all of the romantic anarchists who want to form new forms of community are still going to hold on to their passports and accept the protections of the federal government. And that's what I would kind of push back at you on. And, not in an unfriendly way, but in a serious way. I think that's the...
Yeah. I think Spencer wants to come in on this, but before he does, I think it's fair to say that Atlantic Baptists are historically not Anabaptist on the whole. We're actually much more Reformed Baptist because we're a combination of Reformed and non-Reformed Baptists, and so that's been part of who we are really from the beginning. And if you look at Canadian Baptist participation in the nation, it's been around things like military chaplaincy and so on, and standing up only when we felt that the rights of people were being violated in terms of religious freedom. That tends to be the places where so have owned responsibility, but at the same time recognize that it's under the lordship of Christ, and even though we've compromised often. Spencer.
I guess they put me on this panel to be the Anabaptist. Even what I've studied and so on. I guess, and I'm not kind of the kind of Mennonite that would be repellent to any kind of use of force or even serving in government. I think what I'd want to define an Anabaptist resistance being is that when we engage in love of neighbor, and then that propel a kind of nationalism to that, meaning if I love my neighbor, I'm going to love my country, and I'm going to seek to do what's good for my country. A bad nationalism would then say, what's good for my country, it has to be prioritized over another country because it's not mine. And there I'd want to invoke a kind of Anabaptist sensibility to say, I'm willing to, at personal expense, say, I will give up that good, I will give up that benefit when I see someone else suffering, someone else disadvantaged, when it comes to bettering my country over that. I will willingly descend for that, and I will willingly sacrifice. And I don't see that at odds at what you're saying at all. But I think that should be defined in there. An Anabaptist willingness to descend and willingness to sacrifice for the sake of the kingdom of God that knows no borders, that knows no people group to be more loved by God than another, and means if I know that God loves me, I will be willing to sacrifice even more to show that God loves somebody who's disadvantaged and doesn't know that love.
Thanks for that, Spencer. Geoffrey, is there any kind of collective that you can imagine, collective political grouping, that doesn't have an exclusionary pattern somewhere at work in it?
Well, I think that that's precise. Like, you know, I think that acknowledging that we are in a period that cannot think out, that, you know, there's this line by Gaston Bachelard that says, "What would a metaphysicist do if he could not draw a line?" And it's, you know, so these problems, this way of thinking is old, right? That we divide things into opposites. And it's a particular form of knowledge generation that's organized around creating categories and putting things into categories and so on and so, you know, if we start to think about a politics of knowledge that is not organized around inclusions and exclusions and categories and so on, and instead is organized around forms of hybridity and connections and overlaps and so on, I think that you do then end up with quite a radical critique of concepts of sovereignty. And that may be something which is uncomfortable. And I would imagine in a community that still holds out the possibility of an uber sovereign, some other kind of, you know, this other kind of moment that sure will question these sovereignties, but not this sovereignty. And but it may require, if you're to engage in those forms of practice of challenging insides and outsides, self and other, although that you may find that sovereignty is in fact the manifestation of that divisive line. Right, Carl Schmitt, who's mentioned everyone, is this line of sovereign is he who gets to decide the exception, and so sovereignty is always, in fact, operationalized around the line, around the boundary. So if you don't engage in those kinds of practices, then you start to engage in forms of thinking and communing and so on that are organized in ways that celebrate. It really gets back to Doug's, I think, very important conversation about the question of difference. If we start to think about the question of difference not as a form of exclusion, like that the difference isn't the thing that's outside, but the difference is something that always exists on the inside, I think that we have different kinds of questions that are in front of us. Most of the times we engage with questions of difference and we then either tolerate that difference, which then puts us in a position of authority to tolerate this thing that we don't really like, but we'll deal with it, versus recognizing that the very stance that I have or the position that I have is always already part of a conversation, and then having to acknowledge and recognize that conversation. So I think when you start to open up that kind of terrain, you do see that there is, in fact, a practical form of politics. It's a practical form of politics that shifts the conversation away from how do I create a national community to what forms of engagement do I already participate in that lend and end up in forms of exclusion and separation. What are the forms of practices, whether they be economic, whether they be cultural, whether they be spiritual, whether they be whatever it is? What are the forms of practices that I engage with that the end result is one of creating lines and exclusion? Practical politics then is to contest those practices. That's a concrete form of engagement. It's not a question of do I act or do I not act. We are always already acting. It's a question of recognizing the ways that we do act and attempting to engage in forms of political action, I would say, as a political theorist, political actions that bring into the world other forms of association. So the short answer is no. I can't.
Well, I enjoyed the long answer.
Right, but it's, it's a much more difficult process to get around.
And I've got an eye from both of our other
Yeah,
panelists. I'm going
please.
to go Doug
Give me a
and
dog.
Spencer. You
I
can
want-
fight over it.
Maybe want to, I really want to, I'm thinking about the crisis with the Wet'suwet'en. You're talking about thinking about association without land. And here we are facing a marginalized group, the First Nations, where the land is sacred to them. Can we think of, would we want the First Nations to think about their identity without their land?
Do you mean land or do you mean property? Or do you mean territory?
That might be an interesting distinction you could
Yeah.
maybe clarify for me. But what does that mean for what's going on right now? And and I love what you're saying about new associations. So what would it look like applied to that? What new associations can we be generating to come closer to what they're going through? And yeah, what could it mean for that particular instance?
Yeah. I won't,
Or you can answer, you can, I don't know. I was looking at you, but you know.
Both, and then we'll come back.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, I'll throw in another thing, which is, I was thinking about, I mean, if you wanted to push the sovereignty conversation, Iris Murdoch wrote a book called The Sovereignty of the Good. So you could argue that that sovereignty resurfaces in your conversation basically as a form of, and the line resurfaces as well in terms of an ethical distinction in relation to compassion and suffering.
Yeah.
So although you're in a sense, I think that is resurfacing in your discourse, and it is also to the line then becomes, who is prepared to resist suffering. Now, what's interesting, I think, about Anabaptism is that Anabaptism has a kind of ironic theology, which has been well pointed out by Stanley Harvas, who says because Jesus won, we don't need to win. So in a sense, what Harvas in his commitment to non-violence is prepared to, as opposed to Milbank in Radical Orthodoxy, he says you guys still want to win and to run the world. Now, what's interesting about that is that you're then prepared to tolerate being weak in the world, and then for weak and faithful. That's the path that you operate. And I just wonder whether actually there is a real analogy going on, where you're also saying, because I think I'm wanting to say, I'm not sure I'm prepared to leave the contest for power because there's stuff I want to change through getting my hands on power. I mean, this is the British left at the moment, the Labour Party, those who want a real radical socialist programme, and as they had with Corbyn, and those who are saying, well, you can have that and you can never be in power again under our system. So what's the choice you make? So I'm just interested in that, about whether in a sense you're in a way that's actually rather parallel to the Anabaptist move, saying I'm choosing virtue over power.
Yeah, I think that there's a danger, like there's a stream of conversation now which wants us to accept that we are all vulnerable beings and then own that vulnerability. That's fine in terms of owning our vulnerability, but I think that it's absolutely essential that upon an acknowledgement of that vulnerability, then we have the audacity to engage in forms of a political contest, and as opposed to stopping at that moment of just accepting a kind of it will be decided. I'll just do my small part. I think maybe I'm being unclear when I say that we need to engage in forms of activity that reproduce these things as if they were personal, because I don't see any of what I've been suggesting as personal. I think that they require you to get involved, but I think that it then don't mourn, organize is really that we need to enter into other forms of association that then will critically engage with those practices, whether it be state, capital, cultural, and so on, that manifest these kinds of lines, and that those forms of engagement is not I've done my part, now I get to turn a blind eye and go to Walmart or whatever it is.
So is Extinction Rebellion, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do know
Would that
about
be an example of the kind of association you're talking about?
Well, I think that's, what's interesting about the movements around climate change is that they've changed the conversation into this is an existential crisis. And because it's an existential crisis, all other sub-elements of decisions that have been made along the way are now up for grabs. Whether you drive your car to go to work out at the gym, whether or not you eat meat, whether or not you do all these other kinds of things. Because the conversation has been shifted to this other order conversation, right? It means that all the other subsequent decisions are now seen as implicated. That's simultaneously an invitation to engage in other forms of practice. That I also think, maybe this is a nice way I also think the question in Canada about reconciliation is precisely that existential conversation, right? That it will require, Charles Taylor since we were talking about Quebec, engaged in that process of what is a reasonable form of accommodation of difference. It's already a limited conversation about what you could imagine there. I think that this conversation is one which says the Canada that exists after reconciliation is not the Canada that existed before reconciliation. That it is a fundamentally different relationship. And it may, in fact, not be organized around questions of territory, property, and so on, but other forms of Indigenous association and ideas around use of land, relationships with land, in fact, may have to replace questions of property, territory, and so on. We may use that language to talk about what Indigenous communities and nations and peoples and so on do, because we're putting them into a framework that we understand in English language, but the meaning of those terms may be radically different. And so again, you would have to return to questions of knowledge production and so on, and do that hard work of understanding what does the relationship with the land actually mean, other than saying it means it's a synonym for property, or it's a synonym for territory. You then have to say, well, look at all these practices that go on. All the moons are named different things for different ways in which land practices happen at particular times during the year, and so that's a cosmological understanding of a relationship to land that's different than what a secularized version of we have a boundary here, this is yours, that's mine, something like that. And so I think that that what's before us is precisely the reason why I'm pushing up against the question of, well, what do we do in the here and now with the practical, is because I think that the actual practical work that we have to do today, if we're going to get to do it correctly, requires this, people have called it radical hope, exercises in radical political imaginary. This big level work has to be done. Otherwise, we are going to continue to reproduce the very kinds of questions and problems that we're trying to escape from. And I think that's the danger for me of embracing of already over-coded form of nationalism, to see that that's our solution, when to me it's just dangerous. Not in a mean kind of way.
With all due respect.
I have a feeling he can take it. This has been an excellent conversation. I had hoped we could have one or two questions in the room. So if there's a question that you're burning to ask, make haste to the microphone, please.
He's on fire.
Just, I think, leave it where it is probably best. Yeah.
Okay.
No, at the mic. Thanks.
Okay, but I didn't think it was on.
Oh, is it not on? Oh, all right.
Doesn't matter. I can keep it on.
Boom your voice. I can repeat it.
You got a fuse burning in me when you start mentioning Quebec. Because I was born and raised in Quebec, of course, as an Anglophone. And when they had the referendums, oh my goodness, I can still, Lucien Bouchard, English Canada, and he'd really get under my skin. And of course, all the non-ethical ways the votes were counted. But what turned me around I used to get really irritated at Lucien Bouchard is when I read a book by Lawrence Martin about Lucien Bouchard being raised in the Lac Saint-Jean area. And his father and the French Canadians in that area were treated so, in a very ugly sense, by the arrogant English. And I went, whoa. It helped me understand where Lucien Bouchard was coming from. And I guess some of the same things happen with the indigenous community. And my initial reaction was, oh, not this again. But when I started to understand where Lucien Bouchard was coming from, I went, oh my goodness sakes alive. I tell the people I serve, we need each other. You know, as an English, someone born and raised in Quebec, and then I started to see, boy, I need the richness of the French Canadians, because my two brothers married French Canadians, my sister married a French Canadian, and around the Christmas table, the language was franglais, you know, and my wife would say to me, what'd they say, what'd they say? Because she's from Nova Scotia. So, maybe this sounds simplistic, but I tell the people I serve, we need each other. I tell myself, I need Quebec. I need the indigenous people. How that's going to happen is, as you said, Doug, how long do we wait? I don't know, you know, but the loving issue is the critical, because like I said, I used to get so irritated at Lucien Bouchard. Hardly a loving thing to do, but you know, but we need each other, and hopefully, you know, in God's time, we'll be able to do it. Anyway, that's coming from a English Quebecois, you know.
Merci. Anybody wants to respond, or we just see if there's another, is there a question in the room? Anyone have a question of the panel? Yeah, go ahead, Don.
I'm really going to complicate matters because I'm coming in from an American standpoint. I've been watching both the events in Europe. I've used it as I use Brexit as a diversion from the chaos in the United States. And then watching the election here. And I was surprised when I kept listening to the returns and people saying the nation of Quebec. And I'm thinking, no, I thought it was a province. Which led me to, is there a point where nations get too big that they can't find that community, that something that holds us all together? If you look at the United States, you've got the coast and everything in between. The big thing right now is that the senators who voted for impeachment for Donald Trump represent 18 million more Americans than those who voted against impeachment. I mean, is there a point, you know, you see here, you have Wexit, and is there a point where nations get too big to maintain that sense of community?
Who would like to start?
I'll start.
Do it.
Let me take the second question. I think that it's what we've forgotten is that the territorial formation of the nation came out of was birthed out of a rejection of something that may not have disappeared. And that other something that may not have disappeared is called empire. And empire was, you know, when the territorial state, Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, this idea of the use of territory is called the territorial fix, the way in which to put an end to the 30 Years' War between Protestants and Catholics and so on. This time was the answer to that problem. Right, the answer to the problem of a religious question of faith, of how is it that you're going to relate to God? Is it a personal, or is it through the church, and so on and so on? It was to say that every king, every sovereign authority had the right to decide the religious affiliation within a given territory. And that was supposed to put an end to religious wars, and it was supposed to put an end to wars over empire and imperialism. What it did then do, it solved those problems, perhaps, but then what it did do was then create a naturalness to a territorial assumption of this immediate community. My sense is that we've never left the period of empires. I think that it's not too difficult to imagine how Canada is an empire. It's not difficult to imagine how the United States is an empire in terms of a pushing frontier that is, as soon as you take questions of indigeneity seriously, you can't help but start to reconceptualize the things that you call nation as empires. China is an empire. Russia is an empire. Brazil, an empire. So on and so on. You start to, the return of the question of empire is important. I guess the reason why I'm hanging out on this is that when we're engaged in these forms of struggle, we should know what it is that we are attempting to address. What is the nature of the problem that we are trying to confront? What are the sources that give rise to the very things that we find so troubling in our lives? Is it simply that we don't have a community to call our own, and we don't have this dream of sovereignty that we could control our own affairs? Or, in fact, are we in the midst of a world in which there are forces which exceed the capacity of any newly formed nation state to control those issues? And that's precisely what gives rise to a kind of fanaticism, this unleashing of absolutist desire, because it's the sense that we need to get control of this. And yet, the reality of our contemporary world is that we live in the midst of forces that are far greater than our ability to act individually or probably act in terms of a community. So, one of them would be empire. Obviously, the other is capitalism. The other is, just the fact that we live in an interconnected ecosystem is another. All of these kinds of things are so massive that they exceed the technology that we've designed to be able to solve problems, and that's the nation state. So, yeah, you should be actively talking about, I don't think the answer is to return to a Rousseauian or Aristotelian Goldilocks kind of moment. If we all get together, then we will be able to actually achieve these things. I think that you would find yourself a rowboat in an ocean, as opposed to trying to imagine other forms of association which are capable of dealing with our contemporary problems. And those may start local, but they may find forms of affiliation beyond our own boundaries, cross borders and so on.
Response. Final word, Doug?
Well, I mean, I was the one who'd made reference to the Goldilocks problem and related it to Aristotle's idea about whether there was an ideal size of political community. I think that's an interesting question about, because I mean, I'm really, I think it's been a fascinating conversation. It would be, I was thinking it'd be really interesting to have it on your sofa. And to have us, I mean,
I wonder what color it would be.
But I mean, in political science, one of the problems sometimes, actually, I think, is in secularizing universities. Sometimes we don't get the invitations. I think sometimes we get more invitations than we get, and I think partly because it would be good, it'd just be good for us to kind of get the heat of a politics seminar and get some of our ideas to. So I'm just throwing that out there, but. I think what's interesting, I mean, I'm really challenged and interested in what you've been saying about resistance and new forms of association. And I also do want, though, to do the thought experiment and push that on, because, for example, if you've ever known people who tried to organize in alternative communities or were part of those alternative networks. So my colleague is very active in XR in Scotland, right? And what you find as soon as you go into personal exploration of what it's like to be in an organization like that is that stuff gets complicated and political and messy really quickly. And so the idea that you can scale these things up at some point, even just, are you then just going to say, what would the formula be once you got to the point where you were having to try and run, I don't know, a water supply for a large number of people? Would you just say, okay, well, every time we get to a mathematical number, 50,000 or something, then we'll create a new unit of political organization? Would the bonds, would the affect between those people simply organized around we want clean water and we want to reduce suffering. You know, one of the issues is how do you generate enough affect and common identity to do that. So I also think, you know, that although this may be it's locked into an old kind of problem, it would be interesting in a sense to say, okay, let's bracket all that and let's really start, you know, it's always interesting to say yes to people. So if we started just to say yes to you all the time, yes, we'll do that, yes, we'll do that, yes, we'll do that, then to say, how do we tackle the next thing? And that becomes, and that's a good challenge for anybody to have in a sense, because, you know, can we scale up these ideas? You know, could we really, the action needed to tackle climate change, could we manage to form patterns of association which weren't like the old patterns, but that would really have some kind of chance of working and maintaining peace and preventing further outbreaks of violence while that went on? I think that's a really interesting set of questions, but maybe for your sofa.
Well, I want to thank the three of you very much for this conversation today. It's been rich. I feel like we've only just started in some ways. So can we thank these panelists, please?